The gym smelled of chalk, rubber mats, and sweat, a scent that would make most people wrinkle their nose. But to the men and women who trained there, it was the perfume of discipline. This was no ordinary gym, either. It was the training compound for an elite group of Navy SEALs who were pushed daily to the brink of human endurance. From the outside, it looked like a steel-clad warehouse tucked behind rows of military housing. But inside, it was a crucible where men were broken down and rebuilt into something sharper, faster, and harder than before. Every dumbbell, every pull-up bar, every sandbag in that gym told the story of pain and pride, of bodies remade through struggle. And sweeping the corners, emptying the trash bins, and polishing the floors was a man most dismissed as invisible. His name was Marcus Johnson, though most simply called him Big Marcus. To the SEALs, he was the janitor, nothing more. He was a towering, broad-shouldered man, with skin the shade of midnight oak and hands calloused from years of work no one cared to ask about. His eyes were dark and quiet, always distant, as though they were fixed on memories others could not see. He spoke little, smiled even less, and kept his head down. The mop was his sword, the buffer his shield. Day in and day out, he cleaned up after warriors who barely acknowledged him, as if his presence was part of the building itself. The younger recruits sometimes joked about him when they thought he couldn't hear. But he couldn't even finish one lap of Murph, one snickered, referring to the grueling workout named after a fallen SEAL, a mile run, 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, and another mile run, all with a weighted vest. He probably gets winded just pushing that mop. Marcus didn't respond. He just wrung out his mop, shoulders rising and falling in silence, moving steadily across the mat, as if the words had never been spoken. There was no anger in his stillness, no indignation, just a calm endurance that made his silence louder than any comeback could have been. But there was one thing no one could ignore, no matter how much they pretended: the tattoo that wrapped around his neck. Thick black ink, etched in lines that seemed both tribal and military, crept like fire from beneath his collar and up toward his jawline. It wasn't the tattoo of some prison gang or street clique. No, this was something different. The lines curved into shapes that seemed alive, burning with purpose. At the center of his throat, where the skin pulsed with his heartbeat, was a symbol none of the SEALs recognized. Some said it looked like a wing. Others swore it resembled a blade. A few thought it was a code, a sigil, only meant to be understood by those who bore it. It made people uneasy. They asked him about it once in a while. "What's that mean, man?" "You some kind of biker," one recruit had ventured. Marcus had only glanced at him with eyes that were neither hostile nor warm, just unreadable. Then he'd gone back to pushing his mop, leaving the question hanging in the air like smoke. After a while, they stopped asking. But whispers spread. Some thought it was African, a tribal marking handed down through heritage. Others swore it was military, a sign of a unit they'd never heard of. A few muttered that it looked like something out of classified operations, a mark that didn't belong to the world they knew. What no one could deny was that Marcus moved differently than other janitors. He didn't shuffle or slouch. His steps were measured, grounded. He carried a bucket the way most men carried a rifle, with balance and care. His eyes flickered around the gym, not just at the floor, but at doorways, windows, shadows. He had the alertness of a man who never stopped scanning for threats, though no one dared point it out aloud. When he bent to pick something up, he did it with the grace of practiced form, the kind of unconscious efficiency that spoke of long training. To some, it was subtle. To those who paid attention, it was unmistakable. One day, during a grueling training circuit, the air inside the gym grew thick, with humidity. Sweat pooled on the mats, slicking the floor beneath boots and sneakers. A recruit, lungs burning, sprinted too fast, lost his footing, and slipped mid-stride. His head slammed against the corner of a weight rack with a sickening crack. Blood gushed instantly, pouring from his temple. Panic erupted. Men shouted for medics, others froze, unsure whether to move him. In the chaos, Marcus was the first to act. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He moved with speed but with control, kneeling by the injured man's side. His massive hands, surprisingly precise, pressed against the recruit's temple to slow the bleeding. "Don't move him yet," Marcus said, voice steady as iron. "Neck might be compromised. Keep his airway clear." The room went still. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, with the authority of someone who had seen this before many times. His tone carried the weight of certainty, the kind that made even trained soldiers stop and listen. When the medics arrived minutes later, they found their work already half done. Marcus had stabilized the recruit's bleeding, positioned him to avoid choking, and calmed the men around him without ever raising his voice. Afterward, whispers grew louder. Some SEALs began watching him with sharper eyes. Who was this janitor who knew advanced trauma care? Who carried himself like a soldier but pushed a mop like a servant? Who had hands that could clean the floor 1 minute and stop a man from bleeding out the next? Still, Marcus never explained. Days turned into weeks, and he kept mopping, kept emptying trash, kept polishing mirrors until they gleamed. But the tattoo on his neck seemed to glare brighter with every sidelong glance it earned. Then came the night of the break-in. The SEAL, Jim, wasn't supposed to be vulnerable, but no place was immune. 3 masked intruders slipped past the fence after midnight, armed and determined. They weren't common thieves. They moved like professionals, communicating with hand signals and suppressed pistols. They weren't there for money or equipment. They were after intel stored in the compound's restricted office. Marcus was inside, buffing the floor in the empty gym, earbuds in his pocket, mop leaning against the wall. He heard the faint scrape of metal at the back door before they even entered. His head turned slightly, eyes narrowing, body lowering instinctively into silence. When the intruders breached, expecting an empty space, they froze at the sight of him. Just a janitor, they thought, until he moved. What happened next would later be told in hushed voices, like a legend. The first intruder raised his pistol. Marcus sidestepped, faster than a man his size should move, grabbing the weapon hand and twisting it until bones cracked. The gun clattered to the ground. The second swung a knife, but Marcus shifted his weight, sweeping the man's legs with a precision takedown that ended in a chokehold so quick, the intruder barely gasped before going limp. The third tried to fire, but Marcus had already closed the distance, slamming his shoulder into the man's chest and pinning him against the wall with crushing force. By the time military police arrived, all 3 intruders were restrained, zip ties biting into their wrists. And Marcus, calm, unbothered, as if he had just finished mopping the floor, stood in the middle of them, the ink on his neck glistening with sweat under the fluorescent lights. The SEALs who gathered around stared at him wide-eyed. No one laughed at the janitor anymore. No one doubted the tattoo carried weight beyond ink. But what stunned them most wasn't just his skill. It was when one of the older SEALs, a grizzled veteran with scars on his face, squinted at Marcus's tattoo and whispered, That's the mark of Ghost Platoon." The room went silent. Ghost Platoon wasn't supposed to exist. It was a name passed around like a myth in SEAL circles, an off-book unit rumored to handle missions too dark, too unspeakable for official records. Men said they were shadows, operating in places where even SEAL Team 6 wouldn't tread. Officially, they were dismissed as campfire stories. But here, right before their eyes, stood a man wearing the mark. And he'd been mopping their floors all along. The rumor spread through the compound like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone had heard about the break-in, and the janitor who had taken down 3 armed intruders single-handedly. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, the kind of camp gossip that always inflated a story with each retelling. But others, especially those who had seen it with their own eyes, swore every detail was true. And when the whispers about Ghost Platoon reached the ears of officers, the speculation took a darker turn. Ghost Platoon. The name hung heavy in the air like smoke from a distant fire. To most, it was nothing more than a myth whispered among recruits during long nights of training. A Black Ops team that supposedly operated outside of official command, carrying out missions so classified they weren't acknowledged even in debriefings. Some claimed they were assassins for the government, others that they were guardians deployed only when the stakes were catastrophic. But the one thing every version agreed upon was that Ghost Platoon left no trace, no medals, no records, no graves. If you'd seen one of them, you weren't supposed to remember. And yet here he was, Big Marcus, the man with the mop, carrying their mark on his neck. For the first time since he'd arrived at the gym, Marcus could feel eyes on him wherever he went. Soldiers paused in their reps when he passed. Recruits whispered when he entered a room. Some watched him with respect, others with fear. No one dared speak directly to him, not after what they'd seen. But one man finally broke the silence. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Briggs, a SEAL with more than 20 years in the teams, cornered Marcus while he was restocking supplies in the utility closet. Briggs was a mountain of a man, scarred and weathered from combat, his presence commanding even among elite warriors. That mark on your neck, Briggs said, his voice low. I've seen it once before. Kandahar, '07. A man wore it when he pulled us out of an ambush no one should have survived. You were there, weren't you? Marcus didn't answer right away. He closed the box of cleaning rags, stood up slowly and looked Briggs in the eye. That was a long time ago, he said, his voice heavy with something that wasn't quite regret, but wasn't pride either. Briggs nodded, as if that was all the confirmation he needed. Ghost platoon's real then, he murmured, and you're one of them. For the first time, Marcus's eyes softened, though only slightly. It was real, he said quietly. Doesn't mean it still is. Word of that conversation spread almost as fast as the rumor itself. The myth of Ghost Platoon was no longer myth. It was standing in their gym, mopping their floors, hiding in plain sight. The recruits who once mocked him now watched him with awe. The seasoned SEALs who once overlooked him now studied him with a wary respect, as if trying to decide whether to treat him as a comrade or a specter. But Marcus didn't change. He still showed up before dawn, still polished the mirrors until they shone, still moved with the calm rhythm of a man whose life no longer depended on proving himself. The tattoo around his neck, however, no longer looked like random ink. It was a brand of secrecy, of blood, of missions no one dared speak aloud. It wasn't until the commander called him into his office that Marcus realized his past could no longer stay buried. Commander Hayes was a stern man, his eyes sharp and his voice blunt. He leaned forward across his desk, hands clasped. Marcus, he said, dispensing with any titles, I don't know how you ended up here pushing a mop, but after last night, I can't ignore what you are. You neutralized 3 intruders with precision that tells me you're more than a janitor. That tattoo, you know what it means to this community. So I'll ask you straight, who are you really? Marcus stood in silence for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Finally, he spoke. I'm nobody now. I clean floors, I take out the trash. That's all. Hayes's jaw tightened. That's not all, and you know it. Ghost Platoon. I've heard the whispers for years. Off-book missions, no records, no survivors left behind. Men who lived in the shadows and disappeared when their usefulness ended. I thought it was a myth. It should have stayed a myth, Marcus replied quietly. Ghost Platoon was never meant to be remembered. We did things no one should ever brag about, things no one should even admit happened. You think your toughest missions are nightmares? Ours weren't even allowed to be called nightmares. We went where politics couldn't reach, where diplomacy was dead, where bodies couldn't be counted because they weren't supposed to exist. We were ghosts because we left nothing behind. No names, no footprints, no truth. Hayes studied him, the weight of his words pressing into the room. And now you mop floors in a SEAL gym. Why? Marcus finally looked him in the eye. Because ghosts don't belong in the world of the living. I came back from missions where men didn't. I carried pieces of them home, pieces no one else wanted. The Navy gave me a medal in silence and a discharge with no record. I didn't want a desk, didn't want a pension, didn't want to wear a uniform again. All I wanted was somewhere quiet, somewhere I could keep my hands busy and my mind from going dark. This job gave me that. The commander leaned back, silent. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Hayes said, You know, after last night, there's no way they'll let you stay invisible. The higher-ups will come knocking. They'll want answers. They'll want to know why a ghost has been sweeping their floors. Marcus shook his head. Then they'll be disappointed. I've given enough of myself. I've lost enough. The man I was is dead. All that's left is the janitor. But deep down, Marcus knew that wasn't entirely true. The man with the mop might have wanted to bury his past, but the ink on his neck burned like a brand of fire. Ghosts could never truly hide. The following weeks proved him right. Official men in suits began visiting the compound, speaking in hushed tones with commanders, their eyes occasionally drifting toward Marcus. Dossiers were opened, phone calls made. Recruiters from secretive agencies lingered around him, making veiled offers of consulting work. He refused them all. Each time, his answer was the same: I'm not that man anymore. But fate has a way of dragging ghosts back into the light. It started when one of the intruders from that night, before he was transferred out for interrogation, was overheard muttering a name Marcus hadn't heard in years, a name tied directly to Ghost Platoon's darkest mission. It wasn't coincidence. It was a message. Marcus felt the old instinct stirring again, instincts he had buried beneath bleach and mop water. His sleep grew restless, haunted by memories of sand, blood, and fire. The men around the gym noticed. His silence deepened. His eyes grew sharper. He began watching the door again, scanning shadows as though waiting for someone to step through. And then, one evening, Briggs found him alone in the gym, sitting on a bench with his mop leaning beside him. "They're coming for you, aren't they?" Briggs asked. Marcus didn't answer at first. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "Not just for me. For anyone tied to Ghost Platoon. They're tying up loose ends." Briggs's jaw tightened. "Then we won't let them." Marcus turned to him, the faintest glimmer of something flickering in his eyes, gratitude maybe, or sorrow. "You don't understand," he said. "When ghosts return, they don't come back to save. They come back to finish what was left undone." And with that, the janitor's quiet life began to unravel. The tattoo on his neck was no longer just a curiosity, no longer just a whispered rumor. It was a warning, a signal of storms gathering on the horizon. Marcus had tried to bury his past beneath soap and silence, but the truth had claws. Ghosts had risen, and soon everyone would know why the man with the mop was never just a janitor.